It's easier to be on that waiting list and then come off it than it is to wait.
Common misconception is that whole, you're just a naughty kid, you run around like a lunatic.
Not ADHD is, start saying, well, ADHD can be, or autism can be, or disability can be, because we're just all so variable.
Why don't people tell you this stuff? Like,
I've got time for a poo.
Welcome back to the Not Quite Pod. Today we've got James with us. James, you just quickly want to introduce yourself and let everyone know a bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm James Brown. First and foremost, I have ADHD, late diagnosed adult. But before that, I was a career academic. I'm a professor of science communication, and post-diagnosis, I co-founded the ADHD Adults podcast and the UK charity ADHD Adult
Honestly,
UK.
I'm buzzy for this conversation because ADHD is it's on everyone's tongues at the moment, and it's, as we were discussing, it's on it's something I'm thinking about as well. So first things first, I wanted to dive in, which you quickly mentioned there, a bit more about yourself, a bit more about pre-diagnosis, what that journey was like, and a bit more about you being a professor. Like, the amount of work that goes into that is always quite impressive. And then obviously your journey after diagnosis, really.
Yeah. So the diagnosis journey I can do in 3 dates.
Yep.
1983, 2016 and 2020. I'll get to that in a minute. Before diagnosis, until I had an inkling that I might have ADHD, I just thought I was different, unreliable, lazy, forgetful, clumsy. And the professor thing's interesting because one of the things we often do with ADHD is diminish our qualifications, diminish our contributions, our accomplishments, because we often have imposter syndrome or low self-esteem. So I always say, well, I failed up to professor. I was in the right time at the right place at the right time. And you know what? I was a nice person, so they promoted me. But the thing that actually got me to professor was science communication, because, Charlie, I wasn't a very good scientist. I started off working in the lab. Now, when you've got to follow a 50-step protocol to do an experiment and you've got ADHD, there's a good chance you're going to miss one of those steps out. So I was kind of a middling scientist, and then I got the opportunity to go on the BBC and do a program called The Truth about it. And then that turned into an episode of Trust Me, I'm a Doctor. And then that turned into 25 or 30 appearances, and I switched into science communication, which I'm much better at. So that's what I'm a professor in. It's not so much the actual doing the science, it's communicating what the science is to people. And that made me happier as an academic, but I still wasn't happy. Now, going back to those 3 dates, 1983, I can remember when I was 8 years old going to my GP in rural Shropshire, and the GP saying to my mum, "He's hyperactive, Mrs. Brown, but don't worry, he'll grow out of it." Which, first of all, was a fucking lie. And secondly, was representative of the fact that at that point in time, you couldn't get a diagnosis of ADHD as a child or an adult on the NHS. You couldn't till the year 2000, and you couldn't as an adult till 2008. So it was just I was just labelled a hyperactive child, and that was what I was thought of. Then in about 2015-16, I got a phone call from a colleague and friend, Alex Connor. He's the co-founder and co-host of the podcast and co-founded the charity with me. We've worked together for years. And he said, this may be partly apocryphal, "I've just been diagnosed with ADHD and you're way more ADHD than I am." And we laughed, and we now realised probably not appropriate, but we kind of laughed. And I did all the online tests and just went, wow, okay, that's interesting. But I did nothing with that information. In fact, Charlie, before I got diagnosed, I helped a colleague get diagnosed by saying, "I think you've got ADHD. You should look into it." A colleague I work with still called Eric. But I didn't do it for myself, partly because, considering the fact that I loathe myself, Charlie, I really have a lot of self-esteem issues. I thought that if I took medication, it would change me, which is the biggest cognitive dissonance you can have. Don't like who I am, but also don't want to change who I am. So I just stayed away from it. Didn't really think about it until, and this is a lot of people who are on that journey now may recognize this, until the pandemic, and particularly the second lockdown. That second lockdown, when it was dark, it was wintry, couldn't really go out of the house. I was stuck in the same room, working 7 days a week for the university because everything had gone online. And it just pushed my mental health to the point where I had a mental health crisis. And Alex and Eric, the two people who I knew with ADHD as adults, both said, "You've got to get a diagnosis." So I didn't realize at the time there were ways to get it done through the NHS. So I paid privately. using the bank of mum. She lent me some money to get a diagnosis, and I was diagnosed in February 2021, and that changed everything. For better or worse, for, you know, in terms of direction, but it changed my life, it changed my career, it changed how I view my relationship, and it changed largely my identity, because I stopped saying you're lazy, you're unreliable, you're rubbish, and started accepting you've got ADHD.
That's crazy. Can I ask, I'm just curious, what was the cost involved in doing it privately? Because I've never actually had anyone on to ask that question to, because it's something a lot of people are considering.
Yeah. At the time, it cost me, in total, the diagnosis, the titration process of getting you onto the right medication, and then the discharge, probably around £1,500, something like that.
Wow. So that's a considerable consideration when thinking about the journey. Because I think I see it a lot where, I mean, we know getting on the NHS now where it is, it's getting more and more diagnosed. That waiting list is getting longer and longer and longer. So that's a huge consideration for anyone that wants to kind of try and, quote unquote, skip the queue.
Yeah.
Huge.
To make it more complicated now, Charlie, because if you get a private diagnosis, if you want the NHS to carry on treating you, your GP has to sign a document called a shared care agreement. And GPs don't have to. It's not a legal obligation. It's a professional courtesy. And we're finding out through the charity that many GPs around the country are being told by their commissioning groups, don't sign shared care agreements with private clinics. So lots of people are getting desperate. Oh, I'll get a private diagnosis. And then their GP saying, yeah, no, sorry, we're not going to pay for your medication, which is it's mind-blowing.
It's like the one I've experienced is with my GP. I had to get him to sign a form to be able to access. I think it was something to do with a travel document, and basically it was signing a form to say yes, Charlie's disabled. And you're like, seriously? I've got so many documentation to be like, look, I'm definitely a wheelchair user and definitely disabled. How else?
Exactly.
And they're like, oh, yeah, that will cost you £15. And I'm like, £15 to prove something that I could literally prove in seconds?
It's amazing.
It's the world we live in is crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But that's quite a journey, though, through going through a mental health crisis and that triggering you going through that journey. So how did you come out the other side of that? Obviously, a lot of people struggled with their mental health during COVID and during lockdowns. So how did maybe the diagnosis help, and how did you get out the other side?
So I'm what you call a complex ADHD case, in that I don't just have ADHD. I have ADHD and bipolar and an eating disorder and social anxiety. I like to collect diagnoses. We have a league table in my family, and I'm currently second. So it was actually, but at the same time, I realized I needed a bipolar diagnosis and an ADHD diagnosis. And through the NHS, the bipolar diagnosis took 18 months. And obviously privately for ADHD, it was much quicker. In terms of how I've come out of it, there's part of me that hasn't, if that makes sense. As we get diagnosed, we learn a lot about ourselves. We do get access to support and treatment. And I've changed my whole career to help other people, which helps me like myself and which helps me feel reward. But we also sometimes feel like things unravel a bit after diagnosis, because once you know what ADHD is, you spot your traits and behaviors more, and we drop the mask. We start to unmask and be ourselves, and it can be complicated. So there are parts of my life that are miles better, and there are parts of my life which are constant firefighting, day to day, trying to deal with, I haven't slept, or I've had a migraine, or I'm in a bipolar low, so I can't work. So it's interesting. I'm glad I got diagnosed, if not just for me, but because it's allowed me to then kind of move into a career where I'm helping other people, which is all I've ever really wanted to do. I wanted to be a doctor when I was young, but I was too thick. But now I'm actually being able to use whatever it kind of skills I've got to help other people learn about themselves. And that to me is precious. So that's the main positive. I think with ADHD, ADHD is really consistent inconsistency. We are up and down all the time. Some days we're on fire, some days we can't do anything. And it's always going to be like that. And accepting that has helped me accept that the diagnosis doesn't fix, in inverted commas, me. It just makes me more functional. It allows me to accept myself. But there are always going to be challenges.
Also, like, how are there any like processes that you can think of now that you've put in place that you didn't have before the diagnosis, like helping manage that up and down?
Yeah, everything, mate. Everything I own's got an Apple AirTag because I lose everything. So the second I lose my work bag, my headphones, I just go onto the phone, find it, because obviously I put stuff down. It's a common ADHD thing, and immediately lose it. I've learned of all the different software packages that can help you organize and prioritize. Even the house, we have little things called ADHD stations where the important stuff, the keys, the wallets, the stuff that you need, generally tends to go, so you can kind of suspect it might be in that place. And also, importantly, letting go of some of the weight that I've carried for years, which adds to the low self-esteem. So because of my social phobia and because of ADHD, I have had to cancel holidays, trips to gigs, going and seeing friends, and feel like I'm letting my wife down, feel like I'm letting down other people. But now I can do that. Now I've learned I can say no. And for me, the biggest moment, it sounds awful. And Dave, if you're listening, I'm so sorry. But my brother-in-law's wedding I went to, and I was really struggling that day. I was anxious. I was full of, all the noise in my head. And just before the speeches, I thought, I can't do this. And I left. And as I left, every step I took, the weight just lifted. And I realized I don't have to be in places. I don't have to say yes to things if it's not safe for me. And that again is probably one of the biggest things that I've learned and adapted since getting a diagnosis, is not putting myself through things that used to cause me massive distress. Like weddings for me are hell. Any social event where I'm sat at a table with 8 people I don't know, I just close down. And I now know I don't have to be there. And that's just massively freeing.
It's really interesting. And like, I think that's even less than your average Joe can learn, is like, you don't need to say yes to everything. I think that's a culture we've built in today's society of like, you've got to say yes. You've got to say yes to every opportunity because you never know what one's going to be the one. And it's like, yeah, you're never going to know what one's going to be the one. But also for a event or a thing to impact you, you've got to be fully present. If you're over here and not where you should be, then it's clearly not working for you. And that's okay to also, it's that whole thing of just opening the communication channel of saying, look, this is something I battle with. I'm going to tell you when it's happening. Please accept, like, it is what it is. It's not fully within my control. So it's just compassion and communication. It's something that I always bring up. It's just, everyone's different, no matter whether it's ADHD, whether it's something else or something, or it's just people are fucking weird, and like, allow that. Like, everyone's weird. I'm weird. Like, we're all weird.
Embrace the weirdness. It's such a wonderful kind of motto, is actually embrace people's weirdness. And it's one of the things that I love people who are different. I obviously love my entire ADHD family, the tens of thousands of people I've met with ADHD who get me. They know kind of what I've been through. They understand what it's like. And that, the quirkiness we have, you might call it weirdness, the way we present. I love that. And all people who are neurodivergent, the way in which they present, it just, for me, it feels like home. But even outside of that, I've always tried to be a kind of a compassionate person and an understanding person. And I sometimes struggle if that isn't returned. So if somebody was to say, I'm so sorry, I can't make your birthday because I'm doing X, I'd be like, oh, don't worry, it's fine. Don't worry about it. But I've not had that response sometimes from other people. In the past, I've been completely shut off or, accused of not being a good friend. And it's, it's about compassion and listening and understanding and looking after yourself, Charlie, because that saying yes thing is often at our expense. And once you realize that if you don't look after yourself, you can't look after the people around you, and putting yourself in a situation that's not safe, where you feel anxious, where you're just looking for the exit, that's not a good situation to be in. And it's okay to just say either, I'm not going to go, or I've had enough, going home. Yeah,
completely. What was the journey like with the like? I think because a lot of people that are having similar difficulties, they're considering going through the diagnosis process, but don't really know what to expect. What is involved in the ADHD diagnosis process?
It's complex. It's multi-step. It's designed to weed out people who might not fit the typical criteria, and it's a flawed test. But step by step, the process is, if you suspect you've got ADHD, go and see your GP. There's a test which you can do online called the ASRS, the Adult ADHD Self-Report Scale. And this test is about 90% accurate at picking up if you have the symptoms of ADHD. And normally a GP will go through this test with you. If you have the symptoms and they think I need to refer you, then get referred to see normally a psychiatrist. And sometimes it might be a psychologist and there's a psychiatrist involved. And you have to fill out the world's biggest set of forms, which is massively ableist when you've got ADHD. I was actually positive for 14 out of the 18 ADHD symptoms, but that's only because I couldn't be asked to finish filling forms in. And for the last 2 questions for hyperactivity, I put not applicable because I thought I've got enough. I can't do this anymore. And looking back, it would have been 16 out of 18, but I couldn't do it. So you submit these forms, and then depending on what service you're using, how long you wait, you then sit in waiting mode for, in some cases, 5 to 7 years with no idea when your appointment is, when your assessment is. And then eventually you'll have an assessment. That takes place in different forms in different parts of the NHS, but normally it will involve a bit of a pre-assessment where you'll speak to somebody, go through the forms, and then an assessment with a psychiatrist. And in that assessment, they're making sure that you fit 5 criteria. The first is you must have had the symptoms as a child. Now, that's not the diagnosis, just the symptoms. So if you were hyperactive, if you were daydreamy, if you had lots of different hobbies but never stuck with them, those are typical childhood ADHD symptoms. But boys and girls present differently. And it's one of the reasons that we tend to see more boys diagnosed than girls, that and the fact that the test was designed and developed in boys, white boys specifically, so it discriminates against other demographics. And therefore, having the symptoms as a child can sometimes be evidenced by a school report or what we call an informant report your parents. But if you don't have a living parent or sibling, if you don't have school reports, don't worry. As long as you've got a recollection of what your behaviours were, that's normally enough. Second criteria, oddly, because ADHD is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition, the second criteria is the symptoms must have been present for more than 6 months as an adult. Now, they've been there your whole life, but because we mask and develop coping strategies and don't really notice them, it's often when a big life event like, a pandemic happens, that all of a sudden, your symptoms become more apparent. And then when those symptoms have been there for 6 months, that's needed as the second criteria. The third is you need to have enough symptoms. So there are 9 symptoms of inattentiveness and 9 of hyperactivity and impulsiveness, and you need to have 5 out of either 9 or both. And those 5 symptoms need to be severe, so they're happening pretty much every day, often or very often.
Can you? I was going to say, can you remember any of them? I'm just curious.
Oh the first symptom of inattentiveness is making careless mistakes or lacking attention to detail. There's also often being forgetfulness. Yeah. For hyperactivity and impulsivity, feeling like you're driven by a motor, feeling like you squirming in your seat when you can't get up, getting up in a situation when you're not supposed to get up. So some of the adult hyperactivity symptoms are internal, like this, all the noise, all the I've got to do something. So I used to know most of them, but obviously ADHD memory, most they've disappeared from my brain.
No worries, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. So section 4.
Yeah, 4. Now 4 is an interesting one because there's so many grey areas in this. Your symptoms must be having a moderate, there's a grey area, impact on at least 2 domains of your life. So that could be work, relationships, finances, health, self-care, etc. And that will be drawn out in the process. So the clinician will be asking you questions like, well, how does it affect you at work? And if you say, well, I've just gone from job to job to job, I can't take criticism and I really struggle, dealing with my emotions, and I'm always behind and procrastinating. Those are the types of things that would impact that it's having an impact at work. And then the last of the 5 criteria is that no other psychiatric or neurodevelopmental condition or disorder is more likely causing your symptoms. And that's really what the psychiatrist's there for, because pretty much anybody could ask the other questions. But this is the bit where you need a psychiatrist, because ADHD can present like trauma. It can present like bipolar disorder, like borderline personality disorder, like anxiety. So you need somebody who knows what those other conditions are so they can differentially diagnose and say, no, it's not those things, it's definitely ADHD. And if you look at the statistics worldwide, of the people who get to that assessment, more than 90 to 95% get their diagnosis, because it's a stringent process of screening out people that don't meet those criteria.
It's a lot more sounds like a really naive sentence. So it was a lot more in depth than I would have thought it would have been.
I mean, this is the thing. If you think you've got diabetes, then you go to the doctor, you say, I've got these symptoms, I'm going to the toilet a lot, I'm thirsty, I'm tired. And they'll say, okay, we're going to do a blood test. The blood test comes back. And if the value is above, 7 millimoles litre, they'll say, okay, you've got diabetes. It's a hard objective cutoff. Now, we don't have that for ADHD yet. The hope is in probably 10, 20 years, we'll be able to use objective tests, which are either kind of computer-based. There's a test which children is more effective in children called the QB check or the QB test. Or we'll be able to use brain scans. And the difficulty is that brain scanning is expensive. Our brains are all different, so it's hard to pinpoint something that everybody with ADHD has. So because it's subjective, A, it's a complicated process, and B, it feeds into a lot of the myth and stigma that, well, it's not real, you're all just lazy, etc. Because you go and you say, this is what's happening to me, and a psychiatrist says, okay, well, I think that's probably ADHD, and that really probably ADHD is all we can ever really say, because it's a subjective test.
I mean, it just brings back, and I don't mean to out my poor dad, but my dad's got a very old school view of ADHD, of the whole, they're just naughty kids. And I'm like, no, that's not how that works. There's a lot more involved.
I have a lot of compassion for that, though, because when Alex phoned me in 2016, I was a senior lecturer teaching neurophysiology to medical students and to biomedical science students, and I didn't know adults could have ADHD. It blew my mind. I thought, hang on a minute, what? I thought it was just hyperactive boys running around at school and they grow out of it. And that's because that's the image that's portrayed. Everyone thinks of the kind of Ritalin-fueled 1980s children who are being really behavioral, and then they magically grow out of it. And the problem is we need to change that narrative so people understand, no, it's a lot more complex than that.
And I think the bit that's impacting that more is because obviously it's being spoken about more as we've there's more people going for the diagnosis, and obviously there's also more people self-diagnosing as well. What's your opinion on the whole process of, like, obviously the ADHD process is very, the whole situation is saturated, which means that, as we've just said, people are waiting years for formal diagnosis. So a lot of people are now turning to self-diagnosis. What's your opinion on self-diagnosis?
As an individual, speaking on behalf of the podcast and the charity, self-diagnosis gets you in our club. If you feel that you've got ADHD, if you have the symptoms and you want the support that we provide as a podcast or a charity, welcome. Because it would be so diminishing to say, I'm sorry, you're going to have to wait 7 years before you can use our resources. And therefore, we're very accepting. Now, if you look at this, the reason it's in the news, the reason that it's attracting people who criticize the massive increase in people seeking a diagnosis is, first of all, ballpark figure, the best we can guess, is about 3% of all adults have ADHD. So that means currently in the UK, that's about 1.5 million people from 56 million adults. So that's 1.5 million adults with ADHD in the UK. Probably about 90% of those are undiagnosed. And the vast majority of those either don't know it exists, don't know they have it, don't know it's a thing, and have only started to realize in the last few years. So that we've got this huge army of people who just don't know they've got it. Secondly, there was this conjoining of factors. So we've already said the pandemic and lockdown was a big moment because it really affected. If you're hyperactive, for example, and you can't leave the house, you can't kind of burn that energy off. If exercise has helped you control your ADHD and now you can't exercise as much, it's obvious that things would become more apparent. But roughly the same time, we saw the rise of TikTok. Now, if there's ever been a platform that was designed for ADHD, it's TikTok. 20 to 30 second videos that you can just flick through, bit of dopamine. And as of at least a year ago, I'm not sure if this is still true, the 7th highest ranking hashtag on TikTok is ADHD. So that means a big chunk of the content is ADHD. Now, that's a blessing and a curse because about 50% of it's rubbish. And there's a scientific study that's looked at this. It's either misleading or misinforming. And then at the same time, we started to see some people with celebrity kind of come out or announce that they had ADHD. And this means that the press picks it up, because the right-wing press will often demonize somebody who's a reality TV star and saying, oh, they're just looking for some more coverage. And other people who are prominent announcing they've got ADHD, it gets in the news. So we just became aware of it. It became something that we were aware of roughly all at the same time, and the NHS wasn't prepared, even though we've known for years, if you look at the science, that about 3% to 5% of adults have ADHD. The NHS just didn't prepare, is under-resourced. I'm not knocking the NHS because I love it. I protect it with my last breath, but it doesn't have the resources to deal with ADHD because it's not being given them. So now that's the reason we've got these long waiting lists, because suddenly lots of people are realizing I need help and it's not there.
100%. I completely agree. The debate of supporting the NHS and them being understaffed is 90% of the problem with a lot of this, and that's the thing. And I think as well, as we spoke about briefly before we started, there's a place for self-diagnosis of if you do some Googling and some of the strategies used to help people with ADHD help you, and that helps you cope. Yeah. Whether you've got ADHD or not, there's nothing wrong with that. And also, if it gives you a ballpark to look in, there's also nothing wrong with that. It's like, I think the only struggle I have is, and I don't know how common this is in the ADHD world, but does having a formal diagnosis open as many, lots of doors when it comes to accessing support?
It's a really good question. The first thing I'll say is yes and no. First thing I'll say, I could have just said yes and no, John. So it does. So obviously getting an official diagnosis, and it's important that needs to be not by an educational psychologist, which you can do sometimes at university, or you can pay for it. But the NHS will provide you with medication if it's suitable and if it works with a diagnosis. But equally with a diagnosis, you're then protected by the 2010 Equalities Act if your ADHD has a long-term impact on your ability to work. So it does give you protection. And I'm an ADHD coach. I work with lots of people who are absolutely being discriminated by their employers, who've told their employers they've had an occupational health assessment. The report said you need to make these reasonable adjustments, and the employers just sit there and go, yeah, no, that's too much. That's a bit burdensome. Don't like that. And it's simple stuff like recording meetings so you don't have to take notes. If one person says, no, that breaches my right to privacy, that seems to override the right of a disabled person to have a reasonable adjustment so there's a record of the meeting. I
still don't understand that in terms of using tech to support someone when it's so easy to do, particularly in the rise of AI. I mean, Jesus Christ, it's like there is so much support out there now and that we can utilize. And also we can utilize it with my business brain on. The amount of doors it opens in terms of productivity, it's a win-win. I don't know why. I don't understand it.
It is. The second part, the no part of the answer is that I will not give the current Conservative government any credit for anything apart from developing something called Access to Work. And Access to Work is a scheme where you get support up to £67,000 a year to help you stay in work. And you don't need a diagnosis of ADHD. You can put down, I suspect I've got ADHD, and you can still be assessed and receive that support. And that's massive for most of those people who are sat on that waiting list, who are struggling with work, to know you can get on Access to Work a PA for a day a week, a job aid if you work 5 days a week. You can get all of the software, noise cancelling headphones, all the things that can help you at work, and you don't need a diagnosis. So diagnosis is important to get the NHS support. Sometimes it's important for identity, for just being certain. Some people need that certainty. But in some cases, particularly with Access to Work, you don't need that diagnosis.
I mean, Access to Work, as I completely agree, great scheme. Again, just oversaturated. I mean, I used it to get my wheelchair, and Jesus, I applied in the... I know it's got worse since then. I applied in the January, got a decision in the June, and then I finally got my wheelchair in the December. So it's a very drawn out process, and it's
And it is ableist, Charlie, because often it's you, the individual, that has to order these things, that has to get all the paperwork together, etc. It's got worse. My first access to work assessment was back in 2021, and it took, I think, 6 weeks from application to assessment, and everything was sorted within 4 weeks after that. My second application, when I changed job, it took 4 months from application to assessment. The third time, it took 6 months, and the quality of assessment went down. So the first assessment, I got a 25-page report telling me what I needed and where to buy it. The third assessment I got was 1 page with 6 lines on it that just said mind mapping software, organizational software, and that was it. That's all it said. So as they've had to contract more assessors, more assessing organizations, the quality in some cases has dropped, but certainly you're right, that waiting time is getting longer and longer.
But the other hilarious thing was, I remember when I found out about access to work, I was basically in a sales call with a guy who was measuring me up for a new chair, and he essentially stopped me in my tracks, was going through the process, and he goes, wait a second, you said you were running late from a meeting, do you work? And I'm like, yeah. He's like, do you work like a 9 to 5 normal job? And I was like, yeah. And then he essentially went, right, forget everything I've just said, go through this process, and essentially you won't pay half as much as you were going to pay anyway. And it's like, why don't people tell you this stuff? Like,
yeah, exactly. And it goes further than that. So most people who have a disability have probably heard of access to work, but they may not have heard of other schemes. One of them, a shoot off of it, is called Thrive Into Work, and it's part of a nationwide scheme to help people with disabilities get into work. And you get a one-on-one person,
coach,
who will work with you on coach on writing your CV, on applying, on skills for interviewing, and nobody knows it exists. And then when you look at schemes like Disability Confident, which is it's basically a dog shit in the form of pointless legislation. Because if you're level 1 disability confident, in fact, if you're level 3, like a leader in disability confident, you don't have to have employed a disabled person.
No, it's
and it's just about saying, well, we'd like to think that we'd like to employ disabled people, and you get a PR marketing badge on your website. It's pointless. So the multiple schemes, some of them we don't know about, some of them that are useless, and some of them that are potentially massively helpful but just overstretched, really need to change.
I think as well, the whole conversation with access to work is also, people don't realise what you can use that for. Like you say, I didn't realise till a friend of mine, Chris, who's got autism, told me about the PA thing. I was like, hang on a second. And then I spoke to another friend. They were like, oh, and also if you're self-employed, you can also get support there as well. And I was like, what? Oh, it just...
And I understand this, because the government doesn't want to just throw money at people, even if they deserve it or require it. You'll often get asked what you need in an assessment, and most people don't know. They don't know what's available. Certainly, like you say, most people don't know you can get a job aid or a PA. Most people don't know you can have, heated chairs, you can have rising desks, you can have different computer systems. In some cases, some assessors don't like buying Macs, for example, but there's not a website that says, here's the things you can have, pick and choose what might work for you. You have to try and magically create this list in your head.
Coming back to the ADHD, what are some of the lesser known traits of ADHD? So I think, as I say, the common misconception is that whole, you're just a naughty kid, you run around like a lunatic, and that's the sort of thought process. But what are some of the ones where you actually, people go, oh, that's a trait, you didn't know that was, and so on?
It's possibly the most important question of the ones we've covered so far, because the diagnostic traits, inattentiveness and hyperactivity, most people kind of know about, and even though they're misrepresented, people are generally aware of them, but there are non-diagnostic traits of ADHD that aren't involved in the diagnostic process, but that most of us, in some cases, pretty much all of us, have. So the first thing is that people with ADHD often have emotional dysregulation. What that means is that the parts of the brain that normally regulate how we respond emotionally, in terms of the appropriateness, that's a societal construct, in terms of the intensity, the duration of that emotional response, don't work quite as well. So we can overreact, we can underreact. I'll give you a quick example. I've got ADHD and my teeth are yellow. If you go to any B&Q store, it's chicken korma yellow, so the colour on the swatch for paint, because I'd never brushed my teeth as a child, and I've smoked and drunk, cola for years, and it's something that I have a lot of, body, there's obviously issues about. And a dentist got in touch and said, big fan of the podcast, I'd love to whiten your teeth for you. And I cried for 3 hours. Couldn't move. I just became empty of everything because of a kindness. Now, most people would respond with, oh, God, that's amazing. That's brilliant. Thank you. But I just cried and cried. And that's an emotional dysregulation episode. Related to that, and this is the biggie. This is the big unspoken elephant in the room, and that's rejection sensitivity. This is a form of emotional dysregulation, and it's one that probably 99% of people with ADHD have. And nobody likes being criticized, really. But with ADHD, it can be incredibly distressing, physically distressing. So if you get rejected or criticized or ignored, or if you think you've been rejected, criticized or ignored, and there's objective evidence that you haven't, or, and this is probably the worst bit, if you think you're going to be criticized or rejected or ignored, it's so distressing. It can lead you to just avoid any situation where you can be criticized or rejected, or to become a pathological people pleaser. I'll say yes to everything, because if I say yes to everything, people will like me and they won't criticize me. And you end up trying to spin a million plates and ultimately failing. It can lead to people leaving jobs, leaving relationships. I often say when I do my talks, I hear that your 20s are quite good for sex, but I wouldn't know because I wouldn't ask anybody, because I was so convinced that obviously they're going to reject me, not just because of my face, but because of me. And therefore, I just didn't put myself out there. Now, retrospectively, I was doing the women of Kidderminster a favour, but the impact that had on my self-esteem for years later, that I wasted what could have been some of the most adventurous and fun years of my life, because obviously no one's going to have sex with me. That's the impact that it can have. It's massive. Now, some psychologists, psychiatrists say it's not real. It's not a thing. Ask anyone with ADHD. It's very real. Second one, time blindness. And this is, again, a central part of ADHD. The way in which our brain develops differently includes the parts of the brain that help us perceive the passage of time. So there are generally 3 bits of time management we're not good at. One is estimating how long it takes to do something. 2 is reproducing a time interval we've seen or done in the past. So if you know it takes you an hour to walk to the shops, you might think, well, I can do that in half an hour. Or you might think it's taking longer or less. And 1 is seeing time as a linear thing, where there's a future you. And, tomorrow and I don't know what 2 weeks away means, Charlie. I can't compute how far. It may as well be 3 years. It's now or never for me. And that time blindness, again, means we can either often be very late or really early because we're afraid of being late. Again, one of the stories I tell is that so often that before something like this, a podcast recording or a meeting, I'll think, I've got time for a poo. And then go, yeah, I have. And then 2 minutes later go, no, the meeting's in 1 minute. I didn't have time, and then have to rush back to get into that meeting. And and that's an activity, Charlie, having a poo, that I've done several times before. So I should know how long it takes, but my brain will often just completely misread how long it takes to go to the toilet. And then I'm late to a meeting with my CEO. It's just, it's so frustrating. And again, an absolutely central part of ADHD, not in the diagnostic criteria.
It's crazy. I mean, that's the thing, is there's so many of those that aren't talked about. I mean, I wanted to come on to one that I came across when I was doing my research, which is one that we spoke about before, is the impact of alcohol when it comes to ADHD, because it's something I never thought about. And this was where as I said to you at the beginning, it's interesting for me because it's something that happens to me, that they seem, there's a belief that alcohol basically quietens the chaoticness of someone's brain that's got ADHD, which then can mean that they enjoy that and think, okay, this is how your average Joe experiences things. But then that can also lead to a dependency because it creates that experience.
It's such an important point, and it's not just alcohol, it's many substances. So I'm completely open about everything that I've done in my life, because I always feel that if I'm honest and open, if one person hears that and is helped, it's worth it. And I have a very long and rich and varied history of substance abuse, particularly cocaine. And for many years, I didn't realize why. I mean, obviously, it's really fun, etc. Don't take it, by the way, listeners. But that's why I thought I did it, because it was a social thing and it was, out with friends, etc. But I didn't realize the reason I did it was it allowed me to be social. It turned off all that noise, all that anxiety. It let me sit down and listen to people. And in fact, in my diagnostic assessment, my psychiatrist said, "Do you use any substances?" And I said, "Yeah, cannabis and cocaine." And they said, "And how do you feel on cocaine?" I said, "Quiet, calm, I can sit down and listen." And they said, "The stimulant medication is going to work for you." And I then realized, wow, I've been self-medicating for 20 years by taking something that turns that noise off. And it's similar with alcohol, with cannabis, with other substances, with food even, Charlie. It is that noise that you talked about is one of the hardest things to communicate about neurodivergence to people who aren't neurodivergent, whether it's ADHD or autism or some other neurodivergences. Particularly if you are hyperactive, impulsive, or combined type ADHD, it can sometimes feel like you've got 40 tabs on open in your brain all at the same time, or 12 radio stations playing all at the same time, thoughts and noise and anxieties and decisions and conversations you're having with other people all at the same time. And it's exhausting. It's exhausting. And then when you find something that turns that off, whether it's alcohol, whether it's other substances, whether it's eating, it's seductive, because you can turn all that noise off and you can just sit and you can think about things. And we were talking earlier about creative moments. You can plan for things. You can have conversations you might not have if you're not in that heightened state. And therefore, it's one of the reasons that many people with ADHD, we're far more likely to have a substance use disorder. We're far more likely to have addictions such as gambling addictions, smartphone addictions, porn addictions, largely because a lot of those things give us dopamine, the neurotransmitter that's involved with reward and learning. And dopamine doesn't work properly in ADHD brains. And therefore, people think we chase dopamine because, it's a thrill. Actually, we often chase it just to turn all that noise off and to give us a bit of quiet, which is precious.
I remember I spoke to a parent of a kid that had ADHD, and they were like, "Do you know what really helps him?" And I was like, then I was thinking maybe some medication that calms him down. It's like, no, sugar. I'm like, what? Hang on, what? She's like, yeah, don't give him sugar. He runs around the room like a lunatic. Give him a sugar and he just sits there quietly.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe it.
But again, we may get onto this later on, but there are so many myths and misconceptions about ADHD, and one of them is it's caused by sugar or it's made worse by sugar or food additives. And if you look at the evidence, the best evidence we've got, there's no link between sugar consumption and ADHD development or symptoms. There are tiny, tiny links between food additives and symptoms, but they're in really small, badly designed studies. But we all think that, for years, we all thought, oh yeah, it's giving kids E numbers and sugar and it makes them hyperactive. And the reality is, for some kids it will, and for some it won't, because we're all different with ADHD, and we're all kind of diverse ourselves. We're neurodiverse as a neurodivergent population. So what works for one person doesn't work for another. What makes things worse for one person might make things better for another. It's the complexity, which I love, the complexity and diversity of ADHD. But honestly, Charlie, it's a fucking ball ache when you're trying to have conversations with people who think that ADHD is one thing. No. This is what ADHD is. Well, no, that's your lived experience, and that's great. I'm not going to challenge that. But other people's lived experience might be different.
That's a big part of the conversation when it comes to cerebral palsy as well. It's like you can only really talk on your own lived experience, and that's just something we all need to learn about disability itself. It's like, we can comment on what our experience has been, but I can't comment on Jerry, who's got the same type of cerebral palsy but had a completely different upbringing. These experiences are going to be completely different, and then it's the same when it comes to ADHD and any other experiences. The other thing I always say, and I know I do it as something I do on the side as well, disability consultancy, there is no way you can be an expert disability consultant, because you can be an expert in your lived experience and maybe your area of expertise, but as soon as I throw a curveball at you and go, right now Charlie, tell me about ADHD, and you'll go, I can tell you what I think it is, but I can't tell you what it really is because I haven't really got it.
But this is really important, isn't it? Because if you look at a lot of the big social media accounts, the influencers who either have ADHD or talk about it. What you'll often see, for example, on TikTok is a video that will say, if you do these 5 things, you've got ADHD. And often one of those things will be fidgeting or, being hyperactive. Now, 30% of adults with ADHD aren't hyperactive. And if you're on that journey of discovering what ADHD is and you see that video, you might go, oh, I'm not hyperactive then. Maybe I don't have it. So people sharing that lived experience with good intent, genuinely wanting to help people, but without knowing the broader picture, what the evidence is, for example, it can sometimes backfire and make people think, well, there's no point going for a diagnosis, I don't have it. And that, it's a really fine balance.
I want to quickly come back because it's something that pops into my head. How did you, obviously we talked about, like you said that you'd used quite a few different substances. How did you come away from that? And the other one I wanted to ask before you answer that question is, sorry, I'm doing that thing of, actually this might be good, is caffeine. How has that impacted you? How does that impact you as someone with ADHD?
So interesting. So I'll deal with the first question first. I would like to say I have completely managed to handle my relationship with substances, but I haven't. Yeah. What I have done since being medicated is not had to use cocaine all the time. Yeah. In fact, I don't use it. But I still use cannabis because I get a lot of what we call domestic anxiety. And again, going back to the lesser known traits, this is not a real thing. It's in no kind of medical handbook. Alex, my colleague on the podcast, I think invented it. But many people with ADHD find that it gets to about 5 or 6 o'clock or at the weekend. And when you kind of sit down and you're not doing tasks, your brain will just go, come on, do something. Yeah. But at the same time say, I'm not going to let you do anything. So you sit there in this kind of turmoil of what do I do? Yeah. I've got several hours to fill. And often many people turn to a glass of wine or a joint or something to switch that off. And I still get that domestic anxiety at times. But ADHD medication, particularly the stimulants that I'm on, I take lisdexamfetamine, which is basically a toddler's dose of speed. What that actually does, and we know from evidence, we know from really big studies in Sweden of 3 million people, we know that if you take that, it reduces your use of some drugs. So people with substance use disorders will use substances less. In some cases, will completely move away from that substance. It's one of the many benefits of medication. So medication really helped me. The caffeine thing is interesting because I was going to mention it a bit later on. Now, I'm what's called a non-responder. And I know this because I've had my genetics looked at, and I know I've got the gene that makes me more likely to be a non-responder. And I also know that when I have a cup of coffee, I don't get anything from it. I don't get the jitters. I don't get energy. I don't get focus. It's just a cup of coffee. But for some people, actually, a cup of coffee, because caffeine causes dopamine release, is a way to trim around the edges. If you're not being medicated, having a couple of cups of coffee, which is roughly what would be a dose of caffeine, is enough to cause a bit of dopamine release and just tinker around the edges and percentages in terms of your inattentiveness or your hyperactivity. So for some people, it helps. For some people, particularly if you're on the stimulant meds, it can cause your heart rate to increase a bit and you might feel like, hang on a minute, 120 beats a minute. I don't want to sustain that for too long. I need to go and calm down. So again, we're all different. We respond differently. And coffee is a wonderful analogy of that. For some people, it's a necessity. Can't do anything till I've had my coffee. And for others like me, it's just a drink I sometimes have.
It's really interesting. Another thing I wanted to ask, just because it's a trait I have, and this just could be a Charlie special, is what's it like for you in the mornings? Because I've realised, like, my partner knows me really well, and she knows in the mornings, like you say, till I've had my coffee, it's yes or no questions. Other than that, don't go any further.
So I'm a morning person, and that's, I think, atypical for ADHD. Many people with ADHD have brains that become more active the later the day kind of progresses. So towards bedtime, all of a sudden you get racing thoughts and ideas. And that's often when creativity comes, when you're lying in bed thinking, Jesus Christ, I just want to sleep. And all of a sudden you think, I've just thought of a guitar riff. That's brilliant. And then the tip is to get up, write it down and get it out of your head. But we often don't. We just sit there replaying it like an earworm. So I'm a morning person. My ideal day is get up at 5, start work by 6, and then by midday I've done probably a full day's work. and I'm on fire. And then after 3 o'clock, my brain turns to blancmange, and I can't tie shoelaces because when my meds run out and it gets later in the day, I can't.
That's interesting.
Whether you call it spoons or bandwidth, I just run out of function. But I'm slightly atypical. So mornings for me, I'm up, showered, dress, don't brush my teeth, maybe take my meds, get straight into work when I'm on a roll, because with all the other health conditions, you know, whether it's insomnia or migraines or low mood, that doesn't happen all the time. But that's my ideal day. So yeah, I'm very much a morning person.
I am what's known as a perpetually tired pigeon. I am neither. I struggle with the mornings and then struggle. Well, I can't do early. Everyone goes, "Oh, go to bed early." I'm like, "Oh, we'll just be laying there going, right, what's next?"
Yeah. And Charlie, that's so frustrating, isn't it? Particularly when you are tired. I haven't slept for the last 4 nights. So this interview may not be happening. In reality, I may be lying in a bed somewhere past that, imagining we're having an interview, because I'm so tired from not sleeping that everything's a little bit fuzzy. And that's so many people with ADHD have insomnia or other sleep disorders. You know, like 66 to 80% of us have a sleep disorder. It's so common. And we know that not having slept, insomnia, and this is a quote by Professor Sandra Coy, probably Europe's leading ADHD psychiatrist, not sleeping is worse for our daily function than every ADHD trait added together. It just makes everything harder. So when you're that tired and you just want to sleep, but as soon as you turn the light off, even if you've been yawning and your brain just goes, hello, and you start thinking about all of the things and that you want to talk to somebody about tomorrow and replaying conversations. And this is when I am creative and thinking, oh, that's an idea for the podcast. Yeah, we could do that. And then, and writing songs, writing stand-up routines, doing all these things in my head while I'm lying in bed thinking, please just sleep. Please just
that is literally me to a T. I'm that 11 o'clock sod that goes, so Gina, I've got this really good idea and I want to tell you about it now. And my partner's like, fuck off.
Yeah, it's interesting, particularly the creativity side of it. It's a big, I say, controversial area in ADHD. Whether we are all more creative, you know, compared to people without ADHD. But for me, I didn't accept for years that I was, but that is when I am creative. It's almost the only time I am is when I try and fucking not be creative and not do anything and not even think, that my brain says, I've got an idea for you.
I'm the exact same.
And I then go into this internal monologue where I'm saying, but is that good? No, it's a really good idea. You should look at that. Yeah. Maybe I should write this down and go to sleep. No, let's talk about it for the next 2 hours.
Yep. Literally me. It's interesting, but then I always argue that every disabled person's creative. Because no matter what disability you have, we have to be able to skirt around our needs.
100%. And this is what I wish people would accept, Charlie. And listen, I understand in children it's different. I understand you don't want to say to a child, you've got a disorder, you've got a disability, because of the toxicity of the label, the way in which, you know, their peers may view them. But with adults, this idea that particularly creative thinking is a biologically derived skill that we all have with ADHD. There's no evidence for that. But what you've said is absolutely spot on. We have to learn to do things differently. We have to learn to think differently, to find different routes, to find different approaches. And that is creativity. So there's a big kind of argument of, if we are more creative, just within the ADHD community, is it a learned thing? Is it because actually I've had to find a way to cope with life, and I've found that way, and actually that's a form of creativity, as opposed to the way in which my brain works automatically makes me creative.
It's funny because I always say, if a business has a problem that they can't solve, find your nearest disabled person; they'll be able to solve it for you. Because
The thing, like, listen, again, I'm going to interrupt, Charlie.
It's all good.
ADHD. the thing that I kind of love about that is the strengths and abilities and skills and superpowers and wonder of quality that people with various disabilities have is often not appreciated, not because of people with disabilities, but because of our society and our sector that we're employed in and what is valued. Everybody has strengths. Everybody has something about them that's a quality. But the things that we value in society are hard work, turning up on time, putting a shift in, being productive, you know, all of those things, which many people with disabilities will struggle to do without support. And you're absolutely right, is for many people, and I'm not knocking people without disabilities, but for many people who've not been through the fire, who've not had to learn how to cope in the face of adversity, it might be difficult to understand how that can form you in that crucible of having to learn how to cope into somebody that's a problem solver, or into somebody that might be calm in a crisis, or calm in a situation that's other people are panicking because, well, I've been through things that are worse than this, and I know to keep my head.
It's like interestingly, in a slightly different way, I was having a conversation with my manager today. We were chatting about people's view on work and everything else. I said my biggest issue as a disabled person is I have a gigantic chip on my shoulder that thinks if redundancies are made, I am the first one the guillotine's going to drop on. And that is probably something I've heard from hundreds of disabled people, because we struggle so much when it comes to employment that they automatically right, I'm in. Now I've got to go above and beyond, otherwise they're going to boot me out.
Yeah, absolutely. And at what cost, Charlie? It's the cost of the individual. That often, whether it's imposter syndrome or whether it's wanting to, like you say, to go further, to show that you're as good or better, it often comes at a cost. And it's a really interesting thing about schemes like Disability Confident is people have suggested metrics like how fast do people with disabilities progress and get promoted in your organization. Some people don't want to progress and be promoted. Some people are happy with the job they're doing, and going into a more stressful management type position might not fit what they want to achieve or their goals or values. But again, that's what society values is the title, the salary, the trappings, not the happiness.
And but I think that's a big part of as well the discussion when it comes to job satisfaction, because I think a lot of people take the progressive route of going into management because that's the only way they can get the pay rise. Whereas in any other specialist sector, if you are the master of one specific subject, you can charge whatever you want for that. But in the grand scheme of things, your average Joe, the only way we get pay rises is by taking the next step up. Whereas it's not, oh, I've really honed the skill. It's you need to go up to management, otherwise you can't get a pay rise.
Yeah, and when you look at, you know, particularly in the private sector or if you're self-employed, where it's difficult to get annual pay rises, compared to kind of public sector jobs where there may be, you know, annual cost of living, pay increases, etc. That needs to be able to actually have a life that's fulfilling and do the things that you want to do, sadly, is driven by money. It's interesting. The first time I ever realized this was when I was a nurse. I was a student nurse. My first ever thing that I did. I was terrible at it. And thank God I broke my back before I could finish my qualification. And they said, you can't nurse anymore, because my whole career would have been different. And it led me into science. And I had a friend who was an incredible nurse. His name's Tim, the best nurse I've ever worked with, one of the best nurses I've ever seen. And after about 10 years, moved up into management, moved up again into management, and was managing wards and managing beds. And I thought, but he's a brilliant nurse. And you've taken that brilliant nurse away from the patients that need him and got him to do admin and organisation. And it's what happens. We should just train some people to be managers, and they come in as managers. And some people, you know, give them the opportunity to progress doing the thing they're good at and the thing they love.
I think the catch-22 with that is, because I see it in my day job, is if they haven't done the lower down job and you get up to management, then it's the whole thing of, you ain't got a fucking clue what happens on the floor.
Yeah. Yeah, it is fair. It's the football manager that's never played at the top level kind of analogy. It is difficult. But again, you know, when I first became a manager, they didn't give me any training.
No.
There was no, right, we're going to put you on a management course, on a leadership course. It was just, there you go, manage people. And again, as somebody with ADHD, people pleases and doesn't like criticism, I was like, okay, just be nice to everybody, say everything's good, and nobody's going to shout at you.
Yeah. Coming back to, it was a question you alluded to earlier. What are some of the misconceptions when it comes to, and the lesser known, the lesser known traits and the misconceptions?
Yeah. So just to finish off the lesser known traits, the last one, there's a couple that are interesting. We talked before we started about sensory processing issues, and this is very common in neurodivergences. most people, I suppose, take for granted that you can hear things and see things and feel things and touch things. And it's only if you have an impairment in those senses, you know, if you have vision issues or issues with your hearing, or if you have a sensory processing issue that means you perceive the world differently, that you then realize how disabling this can be. So for many people with ADHD and particularly autism, too much light, too much noise, certain noises, so misophonia, just hearing one little thing as being incredibly distressing, temperatures, you know, my God, my wife, bless her, ADHD now, she's got a diagnosis. She wears noise cancelling headphones when I eat next to her because the sound of me eating causes her distress. Now, obviously that makes me feel shit about myself, but I have to protect her and I don't want her to feel distressed because I'm slapping my chops and eating something. And then the last lesser known trait, which is really important, is we have a lot of these what are called executive function issues, and working memory is one of them. So working memory is the ability of the brain to store a piece of information either about your surroundings or something you've heard or read for a really short amount of time while it works out, should I even process this into short-term memory? So when you meet someone and they say, hi, my name's Bob, and then 10 seconds later you think, what's that? That's a lack of working memory. So, and I can't do names, so I have to internally go Bob, Bob, Bob. And I've done that externally once as well, which didn't come across very well. And I'll still forget that they're called Bob. And it's the reason I can't make a cup of tea in less than 7 or 8 attempts unless I stand there and watch it, because I'll forget I've boiled the kettle and then go back 20 minutes later and forget I've boiled the kettle and eventually microwave a cup of tea 8 times before I chuck it down the sink because I keep forgetting it exists. So that working memory is an important thing. And I coached somebody whose employer had said to them, you said you've got issues with memory, but you can remember things from years ago. And that's
me.
Completely different things. Yeah, exactly. And that's it. They're completely different things. And to turn to somebody with a disability and say, you're claiming you have an impairment in this thing, but you've proved you can do something different, and therefore we don't accept that that's an issue is maddening.
It's
the myths. Sorry, Charlie.
I was going to say, have you ever, because it's just like that popped into my head, because I'm not going to say who, but have you ever dissociated in a podcast? Because I had that a little while ago and I was like, oh, fuck.
I haven't, but Mrs. ADHD has in pretty much every episode she's recorded. And in fact, the amount of times you'll hear a pause and then either Alex or I'll say, just wait for it. And she'll go, what? and you can see it's with Sam, her dissociation has different levels. So level 1 is frosting, she calls, and that's just almost like frosting comes down and she's somewhere else. The top level of her dissociation is she goes to a physical place that existed when she was a child called the Cut, and she goes there and she's there on a sunny day, kind of sat in this beautiful kind of canal side or riverside setting. And that means she's not in the room. And again, for people that don't understand dissociation, to see someone sat there just gazing off into space because they're somewhere else in their head it can be disturbing and worrying. Like, you're okay? What's happening?
And then you suddenly pop back in and you're like, wait, where are we?
Yeah. And that happens with mind wandering as well. So mind wandering, very common in ADHD. It's when you're in the middle of something like a task like this, really important thing, and your mind can suddenly go, what am I having for tea tonight? Oh God, I need to pay the gardener for cutting the grass, and we need to speak about doing the holiday. And then 3 minutes later, you're back in the room and you think, shit, where was I? The word yes, Charlie, the word yes has got me into more trouble than any other word, because the amount of times somebody's been talking to me and I've gone somewhere else in my head and come back and they've gone, what do you think? And I've gone, yeah. I've agreed to threesomes. I've agreed to loaning people thousands of pounds. I've agreed to illegal things because I haven't heard what the request is. And my default answer is yes. Because obviously I'm a people pleaser. So that mind wandering, oh my God, the impact it can have is devastating.
Full disclosure, it was only a dissociation for a couple of seconds, but it was sudden panic of going, fuck, where did I go?
Yeah, and that panic when you're in a meeting or something, it's very real, and you assume that everyone's been staring at you for 10 minutes thinking, what's Charlie doing? He's just sat there not saying anything, because you don't know if it's 2 seconds or 10 seconds. Sometimes it can, particularly with time blindness, feel like forever.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. It was more, I suddenly realised, I was like, as a fellow podcast host,
it was worthwhile.
Have you done this?
I'm lucky in that I'm so bored during making our podcasts. The bits of the scripts that I write, the bits of the stuff that I do, I tend to write myself out a bit, and then I can just sit back and let the other two do stuff. And in the past, I've even left halfway through an episode saying, I've had enough of this, I'm going to go to the toilet, and not told my other two hosts. And afterwards they've gone, has he really gone? So I don't tend to zone out. I tend to get bored, even though I love it. It's like my favourite thing. Sometimes I just think, I'm bored, I want to do something else, and we'll walk out halfway through a recording.
Fingers crossed.
Fingers
crossed we make it through this one.
We will, because this is your podcast and it's more interesting to me. The myths thing is really important, Charlie. It's fundamentally important. So the name ADHD is shit, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, but it's not the worst name it's ever had. In 1902, in the first British scientific publication about it, Sir George Still called it an abnormal defect of moral control in children.
Whoa, that's a mouthful.
Yeah, exactly. And imagine being told, I'm sorry, Mrs. Brown, but your child has an abnormal defect of moral control. Yeah, that's probably where all the stigma started. And there are so many persistent myths that people just assume are right, either because it fits their confirmation bias or they've not educated themselves. So some of the key ones, first of all, ADHD isn't real. Partly driven by the fact that there isn't an objective test. There's no blood test that can tell you if you've got ADHD. But, it's existed for the entirety of human evolution. Yeah. We know if you look at Neanderthals have more ADHD-related mutations than humans. So we know even going back to when there were competitive hominids that there would have been ADHD traits within those populations. And the first scientific publication on ADHD was 1775. And there were a series of books written in Germany, I always get the name wrong, called Forgetful Gunther or something, about a child that had ADHD symptoms. Germany were miles ahead of us. So we've known about it medically since at least 1775. It's a real thing. But again, because often people that don't understand it just think, well, just do it. Just fill that form in. Just remember to go to the doctors. It's very real. It's indisputably real. There is a huge volume of data. Another one that's really damaging is that, as we've said, this ADHD is a disorder of naughty boys and they grow out of it. And what that does, and again, that's partly driven by the fact that the test's rubbish, partly driven by the fact that boys and girls present differently. So boys are more kind of obviously ADHD, more hyperactive, more behaviorally challenging, and girls tend to be more daydreamy and introspective and anxious. So you got a test that doesn't pick up girls' symptoms because girls present differently. And that means until recently, the diagnostic rates were 9 boys to every 1 girl. Yeah. In adults, it's about 1.5 males to every 1 female. But women obviously can have ADHD. It's not just a male thing. But I saw some data from a Freedom of Information request. I can't remember the area of the UK, but in that area, the local NHS trust had screened out 92% of women applying for an ADHD assessment. And that's not possible. It's not possible that 92% of women in that area were inappropriately asking for an ADHD assessment. So the whole system discriminates against women, and it discriminates against people of colour, and it discriminates against a kind of non-heteronormative, non-cisgendered people, because there's no research really in those groups. It's a whole system designed for white European males to get a diagnosis, not particularly deliberately, but that's the test we've got. And the last one that there's so many. The last one that I think is interesting is that it's a trendy bandwagon. And we've talked about this, it's people are talking about it. It's a trendy bandwagon. It's a label that people want. And I know pretty prominent people. I've fallen out with pretty prominent people who have ADHD who have said this, that have said, well, my diagnosis is valid, but now everyone's going for it. They're just jumping on the bandwagon. If it is a bandwagon, it's the shittest bandwagon ever, because it's been rolling since 1775. It takes you 5 years to get on it, and all you get when you get on it is some really weak speed. That's not a bandwagon that I would want to spend 5 years waiting to get on. And it's really frustrating because it diminishes all of our experiences when you're told. And I have heard a psychiatrist say this. It's very trendy nowadays, isn't it? Yeah. ADHD. That was a psychiatrist.
It's mad, because then I think on the flip side, it does work the other way. Like, it's certainly something, as I said to you at the beginning of the episode, friends of mine have said that I've demonstrated certain traits But the other reason I've not looked into it further is, one, as I say, I think I've got a good handle on it in terms of coping with it, if I have got it. And then the other thing as well is, I don't want to see, particularly because I work in the content creator space, I don't want to be one of these influencers that are like, oh, it's trendy to get ADHD. So I don't want to be that. I don't want to be that guy, and I don't want to be perceived as that guy. So then that has a negative impact on the reverse side of it. It's weird.
Yeah. It does, and there's a lot about ADHD that has that effect. One of the things I struggle with is the strength/superpower kind of approach to ADHD. And I get if people feel or have experienced that their ADHD is a strength or a superpower, that's their lived experience. I can't argue with that, and I never would. But often people like that will say that ADHD is a strength or a superpower because that's their lived experience, and it's not for everybody. But one of the really dangerous things that statement does is it allows people who don't have ADHD to say, well, why do you need support then? If it's a superpower, why do you need help from the NHS? Why do you need coaching? Why do you get special assistance at work when you've got a superpower? And when you talked about your, thinking about getting a diagnosis, think back to those diagnostic criteria. It has to have a moderate impact on at least 2 areas of life. So if you're not struggling, if you're not having relationship difficulties, financial difficulties, issues at work that are moderate, so pretty significant, you won't get a diagnosis. So, many people that talk about it in such positive terms, and I get reframing things positively, particularly for children. The problem is if it's sunny where you are and you tell someone where it's raining that it's sunny, it just makes them think, well, I don't get it. It's not sunny here. For people that are struggling, living in a 1-bedroom flat, maybe on benefits, haven't had a successful relationship or job for a few years, saying to them, ADHD is a superpower, is a bit like saying you're doing ADHD wrong.
Yeah.
And that can be really diminishing.
And it's also, as you say, it's a situation. It's like people will say like, oh, being in a wheelchair is a superpower. But my argument with that is like, I always say I would never have my disability back because of the experience it's given. But that's my experience, and I can't say that for everyone. Some people have had very negative experiences. So you can't, I find it really hard when they're like, oh, you're not disabled, you're just differently abled, or you're a superhuman. And I'm like, fuck off. Just, no. Yes, I'm disabled. Like, yes, that's the universal term. That's fine, but don't try and fandy dandy it and make it sound wonderful, because it has its moments.
No, listen, it doesn't. But there's a lot of power in that, Charlie, because accepting that your lived experience isn't the same as somebody else's, that we're all different. We have, people with disabilities have shared experiences in some ways, particularly in terms of discrimination and public perception of us, and in many cases, particularly invisible disabilities, because if you can't see what is causing a disability with somebody, it gets a lot of skepticism, believe me. But if we just, as a group of people, one of the things that I get frustrated with, particularly in the ADHD field, is the lack of a joined up approach. And actually, if we communicated better and talked about the individual experiences, the diversity of our experiences, that, it's not that everybody who has autism is going to be good at maths and computer programming. It's not everybody with ADHD is going to be able to hyper focus on their job for 12 hours and be the most productive person in work, because that's not true. But for some people it will be. And I just wish we could stop saying is and start saying can be. So not ADHD is, start saying, well, ADHD can be, or autism can be, or disability can be, because we're just all so variable. We're a heterogeneous group. We're not all the same.
100%. And that goes for any disability and any person. It's like to have this belief that we're all the same and we all work the same, you're setting yourself up to fail.
And wouldn't life be shit if that was true? I mean, how boring would life be if everybody was the same? The beauty, when I struggled a lot with grasping my ADHD and where I fit in the community and how it's impacted my life. And when I first got diagnosed and I was asked the question, if you could take a pill that would get rid of your ADHD? I said, yeah, God, yeah, instantly, because it's ruined parts of my life. It causes me lots of issues. And now I've had time to reflect. My answer is no, because what I've been able to do in terms of helping other people is worth all the pain. All the issues, all the struggles, the failed relationships, the failed jobs, the self-esteem issues. It's all worth it if I can help one person. If I can help one person then I'll go through that 10 times. And for me, that what I've learned from that experience and how it's enabled me and empowered me to kind of help others, then it's absolutely something that I embrace now.
100%. And I've always said is like, the problem is, if I was able-bodied, realistically, I would have probably come from a very football-orientated family. So I would have been a tried and failed footballer probably, and ended up working in banking. I definitely get a lot more fulfillment out of being the guy in the wheelchair that helps other people in wheelchairs. So yeah, that is pretty much it. But also I wanted to come on to, you mentioned quite a few times about young people with ADHD, and particularly it's a point where parents can find it really tricky because, as I say, there's so much misinformation out there. What advice to support a parent who's got a child that's got, or presenting as someone that has ADHD, what advice would you give them? Is there any strategies that you, from your work, you've come across?
Yeah, so obviously I'm an adult ADHD expert, but there are lots of things which are applicable to children. Now, I don't have kids, thank God, but it is because of the hereditary nature and the genetic element of ADHD, it's very common that parents with ADHD will have children with ADHD, and it's often when a parent has a child that gets diagnosed that they realize, oh, hang on a minute,
I've got it.
I do those things as well. Exactly. Now, if you're thinking about diagnosis, approaching diagnosis, just go straight to the GP and get a referral straight away. Start that process, because it's easier to be on that waiting list and then come off it than it is to wait. The other bit of advice kind of pre-diagnosis, which is really important, is childhood diagnosis is just as messed up as adult diagnosis, because those rules, you need 6 symptoms and not 5 straight away. So it's a higher threshold for children. And that moderate impact on 2 domains of life is misapplied in almost every case. Because normally what happens is you'll have a parental report about home and a school report about school. Like those are the only 2 domains of a child's life. Like they don't have socialization or self-care or health or sleep. And therefore, if in a structured environment such as a school, you get a report that says, no, James sat down, he didn't disrupt, seemed to be paying attention, turned up on time, often that will stop a diagnosis happening. And if that happens, challenge it. Say that's a structured environment. Come and see them at home. Come and look at the impact on their sleep or their hygiene or the fact that they're struggling with friendships. So it's really important that if you feel you've not been supported because a school report has said, no, they're well behaved, challenge it. If you're dealing with a child that's got a diagnosis and you want support, the first thing I'm going to say is, and this may sound counterintuitive, take care of yourself. It's the oxygen mask analogy. You can't be there for people around you if you're not there for yourself. And it can be exhausting, particularly if you've got ADHD, to also have to look after and manage the symptoms which can commonly clash of children with ADHD. Educate yourself. Try and learn as much as you can about ADHD. Create a supportive environment. And that means finding the sweet spot between a structured routine, which can help with consistency, and being flexible enough that you don't see an oppositional response to that structured routine. With things like homework, try and provide, again, a framework and a routine that can help them. And the last thing I'll say, and it's not controversial, but many people have opinions about medication. It's a personal choice. I would never say to somebody, you should medicate your child. But if you look at the evidence around medication for ADHD, the outcomes for children who are given medication are much better than for children who are not given medication in terms of employment, education, mental health, relationships. And part of the reason for this is the stimulant medication certainly can actually rewire the brain a little bit. And it means that some of the lack of connectivity we have between brain areas can be ameliorated, which is an awful word we use in science a lot. So sometimes medication is not just about managing the symptoms as a child. It might be about actually just setting them up to have a brain that is a bit more functional later on in life. It's a personal choice. And I understand people not wanting to give their child, speed every day, but it's something I would always say, at least consider it.
100%. And also it's in a controlled environment. Don't get me started on the whole cannabis argument. I've spoken about it a lot on here. And then lastly, before I ask you the last question, I just wanted to dive in a little bit on the work that you do with your organisations and your podcast.
Yeah, when I think back to when I was a really unhappy academic, and even when I was doing the science comms stuff and I was a bit happier, from there to where I am now, it's such a massive change. So we started the podcast not long after my diagnosis, and it started as a hobby. It was me and Alex recording in our kind of front rooms, using AirPods and the least professional approach you can imagine. And then it kind of, I don't know how, it kind of grew into a huge monster. It was in the top 150 of all podcasts listened to in the UK at one point. And then obviously we spectacularly self-destructed on several occasions and stopped putting episodes out, and we're on a pause at the minute. But that podcast is very important to us. There's 160 odd episodes. The proudest one's the one that after my dad died, we recorded 2 days after my dad passed away. Episode 66 is the only number I can remember because I had to capture that feeling, because we grieve differently with ADHD, and I needed to capture the hurt and the pain that I had because I was scared it would go away. And actually, my dad's a character on the podcast, Robert from Kidderminster, or he was. The podcast is massive. I'm also lucky, again, using the word lucky, a chance conversation with a guy called William, who's the head of Seed Talks, an organisation that organises public lectures all around the country on different subjects, neurodiversity, psychedelics, trauma, creativity. That led to me being able to do talks all around the country in front of like 15,000 people in total now over the last year. I know me, Fat Jedwood stood on the stage at the Lead Mill in Sheffield in front of 440 people, peacocking like a man with all the, like a man with the confidence of somebody that didn't realize there was a mirror backstage. It's a huge part of my happiness now, being on stage and helping people, and doing the online courses and workshops has really helped me help other people. I'm also really lucky that I go into institutions and help provide training. In fact, I did earlier today for the University of Sussex, gave a talk on what ADHD is and how it can be supported in the workplace for staff and students, and getting to work with big organisations like British Telecom and help them improve what they do is really important to me. And then the last thing, this is the weirdest thing of all, is I'm a script checker for a couple of BBC programs where they have characters with ADHD. I'm not allowed to say which ones, but they send me scripts and say, is this an okay portrayal? Does this fit in with what it should be?
That makes a lot more sense, because I had a manager, so I'm also dyslexic. And I had a manager once go, we're going to put you on this new project where you're going to be proofreading XYZ. And I had to turn around and be like, not me. And then I sat there and thought, ADHD also and proofreading. Not sure.
Exactly, and it's. I mean, listen. I've never text messaged you, Charlie, but the amount of people I do send a WhatsApp to, and they just reply back saying, "I don't know what you've written because I've mistyped everything and it's garbled." But being able to do this, because television still has some power, and the way in which ADHD is portrayed in the media 100%. Also has power. So being able to help large established programs make sure they're getting it right and not showing it as being naughty boys, etc., is a kind of a weird but really important thing that I'm lucky enough to do.
I love that though. I know. I love to hear these stories of like people that have started something and then it snowballed into so many different areas, because that's how this started.
Which is I'm going to ask you a question,
Go on.
Charlie, if that's okay. Why did you start your podcast?
So the reason why I started my podcast, I'll give you the short version. So essentially, for those who don't know me, when I started out, I started as wanting to be a fitness YouTuber because I didn't see anyone that was disabled doing that whole thing and was really, really into fitness YouTube at the time. And then I fell in love with, I realized there were so many more topics I wanted to speak on outside of fitness, and then started producing content. But then I really struggled with the whole YouTube thing. I really struggled with the day in the life, constantly recording, constantly having to come up with ideas. But the one thing I've always been good at, as people can probably tell, is chatting shite. So then I thought, do you know what? Actually, I love chatting to people and I love hearing people's stories, because my mates always go to me, you are so weird. You'll go into a room for 10 minutes and you've made 6 new friends and you know everything about them. But because I have no filter and I love finding out about people. And that's why I started the pod. And then also with the uprising of pods, I kind of got inspired by a lot of the bigger pods and was like, I want a piece of the pie. So some of it is selfish and some of it is wanting to help people. But the reason why a lot of our guests recently have stepped away from the disability space was because I was concerned that it was going to become an echo chamber, because it was what I was seeing on social media. Like, the analogy I always use is it was basically becoming every guy in a wheelchair screaming at each other, we need more ramps. And we're like, yeah, we fucking know. And that was why I went, do you know what? I want to get people from all different walks of life, disability or not, and just sprinkle in part of the conversation. And that's why we are now doing what we're doing. I mean, who knows? People probably listen to my dulcet tones and go, yeah, this guy's shite. But here we are.
Well, if they do, Charlie, A, they can fuck off. And B, I want to thank you for what you're doing, because we often don't take time to actually think about the impact we have on people by sharing experiences, by sharing knowledge, whether it's ours or from guests, etc. And we're often just running at 100 miles an hour trying to write, produce, record, edit, release things like podcasts. What you're doing is helping people. What you're doing is important, and you might be staring at your toes and cringing at receiving praise, but I just want to thank you for what you're doing, because it's really important, mate.
Thank you so much. And I think that's the other thing as well, is like you said earlier, my favorite moments are when a random person or follower reaches out and goes, do you know what, you've really hit the nail on the head, and you've really helped me. I still get it a lot now with social media stuff, like particularly young people, young parents reaching out to me and saying like, what you've done and shown what you're doing is really helping my son or daughter that's really struggling. So like, there is a lot of, like, as much as there, I think it's the imposter syndrome that comes in, there is that bit of, am I just being selfish by doing this is because it's something I enjoy? But then there is an element to it where I do genuinely love helping people, and I love that whole thing of like, a conversation has helped. Plus as well, I think that I like to think I'm quite open-minded, so I like to bring that into part of the conversations, hence why I've done conversations around legalizing cannabis, legalizing CBD, not legalizing, but more regular use of it. And like, and that's the whole thing, is like, I don't want to play to this whole thing of the algorithm says what we can produce. And that's the other thing as well. I've gone on a very big tangent here. Sorry. No,
but listen, there's so much in there, which is the same approach we took. We had 3 rules when we started the podcast, and I can't remember them, but it was something like, be authentic, don't compromise, and a third one that I've forgotten. And we've never promoted ourselves. We've never used professional services. It's as amateurish as fuck, because it's 3 people having fun and embracing their mistakes and fuck ups, and that's authentic. And that's what I love about people like you, people that produce stuff that isn't smooth and polished and, you know, perfectly shiny, because you've got to be authentic, mate.
The other thing as well is, I don't know about yourself, but how many times have you finished an episode and you sit there and you're replaying 3 or 4 sentences and going, why the fuck did you say that?
Oh yeah. yeah. It's either that or thinking I've deleted the entire recording, and which I did once, and I had to go into a special part of Windows to find where that file had gone, because I thought we've just recorded 2 episodes. How can I tell them I've deleted both of them? But luckily managed to find them.
Oh wow! And on the note of podcasts, I'm gonna ask you our last question that we ask every guest, which is, what's one piece of politically correctness that you really strongly agree with or disagree with?
It's going to be drug related, and again, this isn't about celebrating drugs, but the idea that a chemical, an inert substance, is bad is bullshit. And the best way to explain this, forget illicit drugs for a second. There are lots of people, everybody has biases, Charlie. We all have biases, whether they're conscious or unconscious, and lots of people don't like pharmaceutical companies. I get it, because they're fucking monstrous. But if you look at the evidence behind some treatments for some conditions, they're effective. They work, some of them with minimal side effects. You know, there is no one chemical that's safe for everybody. If you drink too much water, you'll die of
overhydration,
hypokalemia. Exactly, yeah. But the thing that I get really frustrated with is sometimes when people say, oh no, I won't take, you know, a prescription from the doctor. I'll take St. John's wort, or I'll take, you know, some type of vitamin or something that comes from a plant. They're both chemicals. They both have to interact with something in the body. They both get metabolized. They can both make things worse as well as better. And it's an artificial separation. And this idea that, no, I'm not going to take that medication for pain relief, I'm going to use a natural remedy. They're the same fucking thing. They're chemicals. Yeah. And they often work in exactly the same way. But this idea that something that's made in a lab is bad and something that's natural is good, well, an umbrella's produced. Is that bad? Yeah. No. A tsunami or a cyclone, that's natural. Is that good? Yeah. No. It's a completely false equivalence. And therefore, if people could just accept that, yes, pharmaceutical companies have done shit things in the past. Yes, their prime directive is to make money for their shareholders, but actually there's a lot of medicine which is incredibly effective and helpful, and it shouldn't be dismissed as just being there to make money. For lots of us, it's absolutely necessary.
And I think as well, it's all about like just understanding the risks and what's involved. I mean, I understand the concept of people feel with the more natural remedies, they know what they're putting in their bodies. I get that. Like, there's a lot of complex words, but then also you have to remember that there's a lot of work that goes into producing any drug, and
do you know how much it costs, Charlie?
No.
To bring a drug to market, it's around $1.2 to $1.5 billion.
Whoa!
To bring a drug to market. And this is why many drugs get disinvested at a point where maybe at stage 3 or stage 4 clinical trial, they find that there's too many side effects or that, it's not effective. They'll bin it because they've already spent $500 million and they don't want to spend the other billion. And this is why they charge so much, because they've spent $1 billion on bringing that drug to the point that it's passed all the regulatory checks and that it's safe. Just the other thing, and this isn't knocking you, mate, it's not challenging you, but it's really important. When it comes to those kind of supplements and natural things, they're completely unregulated. So you might look at it, it says, this contains 300 milligrams of turmeric, which actually doesn't really do anything because most of the research was made up. It's unregulated, so you don't actually know if it's got turmeric in it. If it says it's got product X, you don't know because it doesn't have the same checks. And they can make claims which are completely spurious. So you can sell something saying this will help your ADHD, this combination of minerals and compounds from plants and mushrooms, this can help your ADHD, with no evidence that it does or can, because there's no regulation. So again, I get it. And I have taken naturopathic stuff. I take coenzyme Q, riboflavin and magnesium for my migraines, and that works. But we trust vitamins and supplements, whereas actually it could be anything in there sometimes.
It is crazy. I mean, it got part of the conversation we had with CBD tonic. Kate, my brain lost her name then. Kate, and it was that whole thing of like CBD can only be known as a food supplement. I think it's a food supplement, and it's like what? And then like there'd be CBD brands out there that the percentage is nowhere near what they're actually producing.
Absolutely.
And it's the same thing. I mean, it's just about knowing what you're doing and research. The key is research.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, that's one thing I'm very lucky that I have, is I have this weird, if I decide I'm going to research something, I become very obsessive. Don't get me started on tech, because tech is like a specialist thing. So like if I need a new laptop, I would have spent a good 24 hours in the space of a week researching a laptop into the nth degree.
See, I'm the opposite. I'll do it. I'll think in about 5 minutes really quickly and then go, fuck it, that one will do. And this is the reason I've got a car that's so disgusting in colour, because they said you can either wait 6 weeks and have any colour you want, or we've got this awful blue one in stock. I went, I'll take the blue one, because for me, I'd rather make a quick decision than a good one. And that's my ADHD manifesting itself.
Completely. I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. I will link all of your details below. So if anyone wants to check out, oh my God, my brain today, James.
The ADHD Adults podcast, or everything that I do, the charity.
Exactly. You're doing my job for me. James, if anyone wants to check you out or anything that he does and the podcast, I will link it all below so you can find it nice and easily. And I'm sure if you got any questions, I'm sure James would happily answer any of them as well.
Oh absolutely. Charlie, it's been a pleasure. It's been a genuine pleasure to spend time with you.
Thank you so much.